Everyone thinks Elvis's mother died in 1958 when he was 23, but the promise that created the king actually started when he was 8 years old and thought he was losing her for the first time. It was a cold February morning in 1943 in Tupelo, Mississippi. 8-year-old Elvis Aaron Presley woke up to find his father, Vernon, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, crying. Elvis had never seen his father cry before, and the sight terrified him more than anything he'd ever experienced. "Daddy?" Elvis whispered, his small voice shaking. "What's wrong?" Vernon looked up at his son with red, swollen eyes. "It's your mama, son. She's real sick. The doctor says we need to prepare ourselves." Elvis felt the world tilt beneath his feet. His mama, his Gladys, the woman who was his whole world, was dying. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Gladys Presley meant to young Elvis. She wasn't just his mother. She was his universe, his protector, his best friend, and his only source of unconditional love in a world that seemed designed to remind him he was poor, different, and unwanted. Elvis had been born a twin, but his brother Jesse Garin had been stillborn. Gladys never fully recovered from that loss, and she poured all her love, fear, and hope into Elvis. She was overprotective to the point that other parents whispered about it. She walked Elvis to school every day until he was 10. She wouldn't let him play rough with other boys. She held him when he cried, and told him he was special, destined for something greater than their poverty. Vernon worked when he could find work, but it was Gladys who held the family together. It was Gladys who sang while she did laundry for rich families. It was Gladys who made sure Elvis had food even when she went hungry. It was Gladys who believed in him when the whole world saw just another poor boy from the wrong side of town. And now, at age 8, Elvis was being told his mama was dying. Gladys had been sick for 2 weeks with what everyone initially thought was the flu. But the fever wouldn't break, and she'd become so weak she could barely stand. The local doctor, Dr. William Hunt, had finally made a house call to the Presleys' 2-room shotgun house. What he found alarmed him greatly. Gladys had developed a severe case of pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and exhaustion from years of overwork. Her lungs were filled with fluid, and her body was too weak to fight the infection. "Mr. Presley," Dr. Hunt had said quietly, pulling Vernon aside, "your wife needs to be in a hospital." But even then, he trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Even with hospital care, Gladys's chances of survival were slim. But the Presleys didn't have money for a hospital. They barely had money for food. Vernon had been in and out of work, and medical bills were an impossible luxury for a family that sometimes couldn't afford shoes. "Keep her comfortable," Dr. Hunt finally said, "and let the boy say goodbye." Vernon brought Elvis into the bedroom where Gladys lay, her face pale and her breathing shallow and labored. The small room smelled of sickness and the coal oil lamp that burned day and night because they couldn't afford proper heat. "Mama?" Elvis whispered, climbing onto the bed beside her. Gladys's eyes fluttered open, and despite her weakness, she managed a smile for her baby boy. "Hey there, my beautiful boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elvis grabbed her hand, which felt hot and fragile in his small grip. "Daddy says you're real sick, Mama. But you're going to get better, right? You have to get better." Gladys's eyes filled with tears. She knew what the doctor had told Vernon. She knew her son was about to lose his mother, and she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him alone in this cruel world. "Elvis, baby," Gladys said, struggling to sit up slightly, "I need you to listen to me real careful. Can you do that?" Elvis nodded, his own tears starting to fall. "Baby, I need you to promise me something," Gladys said, gripping his hand with what little strength she had left. "Even if something happens to me, even if I'm not here anymore, I need you to promise me you won't ever give up on your dreams." Elvis was crying openly now. "Mama, don't talk like that. You're gonna be fine. You have to be fine. I can't. I need you, Mama." "Listen to me," Gladys insisted, her voice urgent despite its weakness. "You're special, Elvis. You got a gift from God, and I need you to promise me you'll use it. Promise me you'll sing, baby. Promise me you'll let the world hear that beautiful voice." "I promise, Mama," Elvis sobbed. "But only if you promise to get better. Please, Mama, please don't leave me." Gladys pulled her son close, ignoring the pain it caused her labored lungs. "Sing for me, baby," she whispered. "Sing that song I love, the one about the old rugged cross. Sing it for your mama one more time." Through his tears, 8-year-old Elvis began to sing The Old Rugged Cross. His voice was small and broken with emotion, cracking with fear and desperation, but he sang it anyway because his mama asked him to. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. As Elvis sang, something remarkable happened. Gladys's breathing seemed to slow and deepen. The frantic, shallow gasps began to ease into more regular breaths. Vernon stood in the doorway, watching his son sing to his dying wife, and he found himself praying harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. Elvis sang all 4 verses, his small hand clutching his mother's hot one, his tears falling onto the threadbare blanket that covered her. When he finished, Gladys was sleeping, truly sleeping, not the unconscious fever state she'd been in for days. "Keep singing, son," Vernon whispered from the doorway. "Don't stop singing." For the next 3 days, Elvis barely left his mother's bedside. He sang every song he knew. Church songs, songs Gladys had taught him, songs he'd heard on the radio. When he ran out of songs, he made up new ones. Simple melodies with words about his mama getting better. Vernon brought food that Elvis barely touched. Neighbors stopped by with soup and prayers. But Elvis just kept singing, as if his voice alone could keep his mother tethered to this world. On the 3rd day, something incredible happened. Gladys's fever broke. She opened her eyes, truly conscious for the first time in days, and the first thing she heard was her son singing. "Elvis," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Elvis stopped singing and stared at his mother in wonder. "Mama, are you better?" Gladys managed a weak smile. "I heard you, baby. Every song. Even when I couldn't open my eyes or speak, I heard your voice and it kept me here." Dr. Hunt couldn't explain Gladys's recovery. By all medical understanding, she should have died. Her body had been too weak, her infection too severe, her living conditions too poor to support healing. "It's a miracle," the doctor finally said. "Pure and simple, Mrs. Presley, you've experienced a miracle." But Gladys knew better. She knew it wasn't just divine intervention. It was the sound of her son's voice singing her back from the edge of death. It was the power of a mother's love for her child and a child's desperate love for his mother, manifested through music. As Gladys slowly recovered over the following weeks, she made a decision that would shape the rest of Elvis's life. She told him, again and again, about the power his voice had to heal, to save, to change things. "You saved my life with your singing, baby," she would say. "God gave you that voice for a reason. You got a purpose, and part of that purpose is to use your gift to touch people's hearts." Elvis, at age 8, took his mother's words as gospel truth. If his singing could save his mama's life, then maybe his voice really was special. Maybe he really was meant for something greater than their small, poor life in Tupelo. After Gladys's near-death experience, the already intense bond between mother and son became something beyond normal family attachment. Elvis became even more protective of his mother, checking on her constantly, refusing to leave her side for long periods. Gladys, meanwhile, became obsessed with nurturing Elvis's musical gift. She encouraged him to sing at church, at local events, anywhere people would listen. She told anyone who would hear about the time her boy's singing saved her life. "That child has healing in his voice," Gladys would say. "I know it because I was dying, and his singing brought me back." Some people thought Gladys was being overly dramatic. Others whispered that she was putting too much pressure on such a young child. But Gladys didn't care. She believed, with absolute certainty, that her son was destined for greatness, and she would do everything in her power to help him achieve it. As Elvis grew older, the memory of his mother's near death became the foundation of his relationship with music. Every time he sang, he remembered being 8 years old, sitting beside his dying mother, using his voice to keep her alive. When other kids mocked his singing style, Elvis didn't care. His voice had saved his mama. That was all the validation he needed. When teachers told him he sang too emotionally, too intensely, Elvis ignored them. He sang the way he did because he'd learned that music wasn't just entertainment. It was power. It was life and death. When he later auditioned for the school choir and was rejected, it hurt, but it didn't break him. Because deep down, Elvis knew something those teachers didn't. His voice had already accomplished something more important than any choir performance. It had cheated death. As Elvis's career began to take off in the 1950s, he never forgot his mother's near death or the promise he'd made at age 8. Every performance was, in some way, a fulfillment of that promise. To use his voice, to let the world hear it, to never give up on his dreams. Gladys watched her son become famous with a mixture of pride and fear. She was thrilled that his gift was being recognized, but she worried constantly about his health, his safety, his happiness. The protective mother who had almost died when he was 8 never stopped trying to shield him from the world. "Mama, I made it," Elvis would tell her. "I kept my promise. I used my voice like you told me to." "I know, baby," Gladys would reply. "I always knew you would." In August 1958, when Elvis was 23 years old, Gladys Presley fell ill again. This time, it was hepatitis, complicated by years of prescription drug use and alcohol abuse, brought on by the stress of her son's fame. Elvis, now in the Army and stationed in Texas, rushed home to Memphis when he heard his mother was hospitalized. He sat by her bedside at Methodist Hospital, holding her hand just as he had when he was 8 years old. "Sing for me, baby," Gladys whispered, her voice weak, "like you did when you saved me before." So Elvis sang. He sang Old Shep, Peace in the Valley, and The Old Rugged Cross. The same songs he'd sung 15 years earlier when his voice had brought her back from death's door. But this time, no miracle came. Gladys's condition worsened despite Elvis's singing. Despite his prayers, despite his desperate belief that his voice could save her again. On August 14, 1958, Gladys Presley died with her son Elvis holding her hand and singing softly to her. Elvis was devastated by his mother's death. But there was another layer to his grief that few people understood. He felt like he'd failed. When he was 8, his singing had saved her. At 23, it hadn't been enough. "Why didn't it work, Daddy?" Elvis asked Vernon through his tears. "I sang just like before. Why couldn't I save her this time?" Vernon held his son and tried to explain that Gladys's death wasn't Elvis's fault, that you can't cheat death forever, that Elvis's singing had given Gladys 15 extra years of life that she might not have had. But Elvis couldn't shake the feeling that he'd broken the promise he made at age 8. He'd promised to use his voice, to never give up on his dreams, to make her proud. And somehow, in his grief-stricken mind, he felt like he'd failed her when it mattered most. For the rest of his life, Elvis carried the weight of that childhood promise and the guilt of his mother's death. He threw himself into his career with an intensity that sometimes worried those around him, as if he was trying to prove his voice still mattered, still had power, still could heal. He poured emotions into his performances that went far beyond normal entertainment. When Elvis sang, he sang like he was trying to save someone's life, because once, when he was 8 years old, he had. The promise Elvis made to his dying mother, when he was 8 years old, to use his voice, to chase his dreams, to let the world hear his gift, became the driving force of his entire career. And the guilt he felt for not being able to save her with his singing at age 23 haunted him until his own death in 1977. Most people know that Elvis loved his mother deeply and was devastated by her death. But few know the full story of how that relationship was forged in a moment of childhood terror, when an 8-year-old boy sang his dying mother back to life. That moment created the Elvis Presley the world came to know, a man who sang with desperate intensity, who believed in the healing power of music, who used his voice like it was a lifeline, because once it literally was. The promise made in that small, poor room in Tupelo in 1943 became the foundation of the greatest career in rock and roll history. But it also created a burden that Elvis carried until his dying day. the impossible expectation that his voice could save the people he loved, and the crushing guilt when it couldn't. Elvis Presley became the king of rock and roll, but he started as an 8-year-old boy who sang to keep his mama alive, who made a promise at what he thought was her deathbed, and who spent the rest of his life trying to honor that promise and overcome the guilt of feeling like he'd ultimately failed. If this story of love, loss, and the promises we make in our darkest moments moved you, make sure to subscribe and share. Let us know in the comments if you've ever made a promise that changed your life. Sometimes our greatest strengths are born from our deepest fears.